In this episode, you will learn how to create hurtboxes and hitboxes and how to hurt the player. Hello and welcome to how to create a Vampire Survivors clone in Godot 4. So today we're just going to get right into it since it's a bit of a big one, and we're just going to be adding some HP values to our player and our enemies. So var HP equals 80. Just gonna control save that and export var HP equals 10 for our enemy, which will create a new drop down there. Now we're going to be creating a hurtbox and a hitbox. So all this is going to be is a node called an area 2D, which is just a area that detects collision but doesn't actually enforce it. We're going to give this a collision shape 2D. I'm just going to call this one hurtbox. I'm going to call this one hitbox. So we're going to start with the hitbox since it's the most simple one. And I'm just going to give this a timer as well, which we will use in good time. I'm going to do a control save, kind of create a new folder called utility and save the hitbox in there and then add a new script. So we're going to start off very simple with what a hitbox is. So a hitbox is sort of I'm hitting you versus a hurtbox, which is I'm getting hurt. Think of it in this way: I'm hurting versus I'm hitting. So a hitbox is the aggressive one. So we're going to just give this a very simple export variable for damage. I'm going to make that equal 1, and we're going to save that for now. We will be returning to our hitbox, but we're going to be making our hurtbox, which is in a very similar structure, an area 2D, which I'll rename as hurtbox. It's going to have a collision shape, and it's also going to have a timer. Now I'm going to control S to save the hurtbox in the utility folder and add a new script to it. Now I'm just going to get my my reference script so I don't screw anything up. And we are going to be making multiple types of hurtboxes within the same script. And we're going to be doing this by creating an export enum. And this is going to define what the style of hitbox is going to be. So we're going to be making one which has called cooldown, one which is called hit once, and one which is called disable hitbox. And this is going to be a variable, and it's going to be called the hurtbox type, and we're going to make it equal 0 because cooldown is 0, hit once is 1, and disable hitbox is 2 because it is an enum. Now, I'm just going to quickly do some referencing. So onReady var collision equals collision shape 2D. onReady var disable timer equals get, well, we're not going to do a get node. Instead, I'm just going to rename this as disable timer. And we're just going to do disable timer. And then we're also going to create a signal called hurt, which we'll get into later since we're going to create a signal from the area. So what a signal is, it's a built-in condition for a node type. So for an area type, which is able to detect collisions but not actually enforce them, we are able to detect if an area enters our area. So let's say, for example, our hitbox enters our area, our hurtbox. We want to run the area entered. We'll do a bit more in theory time there, but to connect a signal, you double click it, it will create a receiver method. It will try to connect to a script, which is normally the parent, and we click on connect and it creates a new function. So now whenever an area enters, this will trigger. So we're going to be trying to get the hitbox to be detected in this script. So I'm going to start this with if area, and the area is going to be the area that enters, is in group attack. Currently this does nothing because there's no group called attack, but we're going to go into our hitbox and add our hitbox into the attack group. Just going to Control S that to save. We're then going to check if the area has the variable damage. So we're checking that it does have damage because we're going to need this value, and we want to make sure that our HurtBox script isn't going to crash the game. So this is why we do the checks. We're then going to match the HurtBox type, and this is going to be sort of how the HurtBox resets itself. So on our enum, we're going to be checking for cooldown. If it is on the cooldown, we're going to disable the collision shape 2D. And we're going to be doing this with collision.callDeferred set disabled true. And this will disable the collision shape. Now, this can be done with collision.disabled equal true, and this will technically work, but there is a issue when this is done in real time, and the description actually says this project should be changed with object.setDeferred. You'll get a bug when this happened. And then after a short period of time, let's set this to 0.5 seconds. So we're just going to start this timer, .start. And we're going to connect a new signal called timeout. So this will trigger when the timer times out, which is going to be 0.5 seconds. So we're going to connect that signal, and we're just going to re-enable the collision shape. So instead of true, we'll set this to false because we don't want it to be disabled. And that's all we need to do for the cooldown. Now, the second type is going to be hit once. This is a bit more complicated, and we're not going to go into this in this tutorial. We will go into it in a future tutorial, just not this one. There's a couple of additional layers that need to be made before we actually create this HurtBox type. Now, the next one, which is going to be disable hitbox, is instead of disabling the collision shape in the HurtBox, we're going to be disabling it within the hitbox. So we're going to be going if area.has method, and I'm just going to call this method temp disable. This is going to be a user-defined method, which we'll add into our hitbox later. We're going to do, if it has the method, we're going to temp disable it. After that, we're going to create a variable called damage equals area.damage. And then we are going to emit our own custom signal that we made. So you can probably see that in our GD script signals, we've actually created our own one. So we're just going to type in emit signal, hurt, and then damage as an argument. So when we emit this signal, it's going to send in the area's damage, and that's going to be the hitbox. Now, we added this temp disable. We're trying to call it, so we actually have to add the it within our script. So I'm just going to be doing a little bit more referencing. So once again, we're just going to rename this, and I'm just going to be calling this disable hitbox timer. And then we're just going to do the standard onReady var collision equals collision shape 2D onReady var disable timer equals disable hitbox timer. And then we're just going to do a function temp disable. And it's exactly this, well, it's very similar to how the HurtBox does it, which is just call third, set, disabled, true. Then we're going to start our disable timer. Well, and I say it's similar. What I actually mean is that it's identical to it. So once again, we're going to make this every half second. The frame is going to re-enable, and it's going to be a one shot, so it only runs once. I'm going to connect the timeout to our hitbox, and we're just going to re-enable the collision shape. False. And that is actually all we need to do with the hitbox, except for collision layers. So at the moment, these areas and these functions will kind of, they'll trigger for anything, even though we have our checks. And we don't really want everything to be on the same collision layer. And the collision layers are just sort of how things detect each other. So we're going to go into the project settings and we're going to set the names of the layers. So layer 1 will be world, layer 2 will be player, layer 3 will be enemy, and layer 4 will be loot. I will be going more in depth with layers in the theory time, so we'll talk about it more. But we're going to, in the kind of parent of the hitbox, we're going to actually be removing the layers. And if you kind of mouse over, you'll see that they now have names. And we're going to be doing the same thing for the HurtBox. But we're going to be adding our HurtBoxs and hitboxes into our player and our enemy. So we're going to start this off with the HurtBox. And we're going to go into our enemy scene. We're going to right click and click on editable children. We're going to go into the collision shape 2D and we're going to add a rectangle shape. So every one of these will have its own unique collision shape. We're going to be making the enemy's HurtBox quite big because we want it to be easy to hit the player. And this is actually all that needs to be done. We're just going to make it so that the HurtBox type is currently in the cooldown. It's not going to do much. And we're also going to be making so that the collision shape, the HurtBox, we only want this to be on the enemy layer. And then for the hitbox, we're going to do the same thing. Editable children, collision shape. We're going to add a new rectangle, and we want the hitbox to be a bit small. So I'm going to hide the HurtBox for the moment, and we're going to reshape the size of the hitbox to be just a bit small because we want the enemy to really be on top of it, on top of the player when it hits it. So we're just going to save that, and I'm going to be going into the collision, and I'm going to be making so that the hitbox is on the player layer, and we'll save that. I'm going to also hide the collision shape, which will be on layer world, I believe. Well, it'll be associated with the body, which is on the player world. We'll leave that as that. So in the player, we're also going to add a HurtBox. We're not going to be adding a hitbox to the player because we don't really want the player to directly hurt the enemies. So I'm going to click on editable children. We're going to go to collision shape, add a rectangle, and I'm going to be making the player HurtBox quite small because you want to give the player as many advantages as they can so they feel like the game is more fair. And we're just going to go into the collision, and we're going to make it so that the HurtBox is respondent to the enemy's hitbox. So in fact, I should probably just swap these around. So the HurtBox is relevant to the player, the enemy's HurtBox is relevant to the enemy, and the HitBox is relevant to the player. Okay, cool. So I did it right the first time. And then we are going to be connecting the hurt signal. So I'm going to connect it there. And then I am just going to be doing HP minus equals damage. And then I'm just going to be printing the damage that is, well, the HP that the player takes, just so you can see it down below. And in the enemy, we're going to be doing the exact same thing with the HurtBox. We're just going to be doing HP minus equals damage. And we're also going to be doing a if HP is less or equal to 0, we're going to Q3 our enemy. This isn't going to be ran in the current build, but what Q3 does, it deletes the enemy from the game. So it's effectively a way of destroying the enemy. And now, for this to run, we should be able to click on play. And hopefully within the script, you'll be able to start seeing some HP values. Oops, my bad. So walking towards us, and you can see right there that the player's HP is going down in values. And you can see this by clicking on visible collision shapes, that when the player gets hit, you can see that it's going from gray to blue as it's set to the cooldown. But if we go into the player's HurtBox, go into the HurtBox type and change this to disable hitbox, what you'll find is that the enemy's HurtBox is going to go gray and then blue. So that's how these HurtBoxs, hidden hitboxes work. There's going to be a lot of discussion in theory time, so meet you there. In the tutorial, we used something called signals, and I wanted to go over them again with a bit more detail. A signal is a built-in condition that can trigger a function in another script. In our example of an area 2D, we used an area entering into another area condition. But each node will have many unique signals. It will also inherit any signals from its parent type. So you can see that an area 2D is also a collision object 2D, which is also a canvas item, which is also a node, which is also an object. I would primarily focus on learning the node-specific signals, but just keep in mind that there are a lot of them and it's easy to get overwhelmed. As you saw in the tutorial, you are also able to make your own custom signals. You declare it up top and then call it with emit signal. And to connect, you just go to the scene and connect it to the script that you want. The Godot community has a saying with signals: signal up, call down. What this means is that it's typically better to use signals to call a parent script than it is to call a function of a parent. For example, with the HurtBox, instead of signals, we could use a getParent.hurt instead of using the hurt signal and connecting it to the parent, but it is advised to use signals since the parent may not always have the hurt function, or perhaps you don't want to connect the signal with the parent after creating a multi-purpose object. As a whole, it's just a cleaner implementation to implement, and I feel like it's easier to maintain. This isn't a hard rule or anything like that, so if you find a case where calling a parent function is easier, then go for it, but do keep in mind that signals should be a preferred option in most cases. As shown in the tutorial, Godot has collision layers, and there are 32 layers within the UI. These layers impact body and area nodes and make it so that in order for them to collide with each other, they need to share a physics layer. In addition to layers, there are masks, and they do two different things. The layer tells us, I exist on the following layers. The mask tells us, I will collide with items that exist on the following layers. So if we go back to our project, we will note that we really only need the enemy hitbox to be on layer 2 and not on mask 2. And for our player's HurtBox, we only need it to be on mask 2. And on the enemy's HurtBox, we should really only have this on mask 3. The HurtBox needs to be colliding with something to activate its area entered signal, and the hitbox just needs to exist on the layer. If we wanted to connect one of the entered/exit signals on the hitbox, we would need to put it on the layer rather than just a mask. Now, in this tutorial, you can be lazy and just keep them both at the same time, but it's an important distinction to keep in mind. This can improve in performance and reduce bugs for more complicated projects. So whenever an area with group attack enters the HurtBox, it will check if it has a damage value associated with it. If it does, we will check the HurtBox type. If it's cooldown, then the HurtBox collision shape will be disabled for 0.5 seconds. Afterwards, it will be re-enabled. If it's disable hitbox, then we will check if the collision shape for the area in the attack group has the method temp disable. If it does, the area.tempDisable method is called, and it will have its collision shape disabled for 0.5 seconds. Regardless of how the collision shape is disabled, the area damage will be thrown into the hurt signal, which when connected to our player or our enemy, will reduce the body's HP by the damage argument, which is the damage value within our hitbox object.
No one cared who I was till I put on the mask.